The wind didn't whistle that morning. It rasped, dragging dust and forgotten leaves through the gravel lot like old bones being stirred. The town's auction yard stood braced against the weather, stoic and peeling at the corners. Rusted railings, chipped numbers, and the kind of silence that hangs around just before someone decides to shout. She was already there, tucked into the back, wrapped in a coat too big at the sleeves and too thin at the spine. Her boots were scuffed, soles worn nearly clean of tread, and her fingers were raw from nights she didn't speak about. No one noticed her, which was the point. She'd gotten good at that, being part of the background, a story no one thought to hear. The horse stood swaying in the pen. Lot 47. A faded gelding with ribs like half-finished prayers, and a coat that had once gleamed, but now wore the dust of too many years. He was older than he looked, which said something, and heavier in the eyes than most animals could afford to be. People laughed. They always did at horses like that, horses that looked more like a favor than a bargain. Somebody ought to shoot it, someone muttered nearby. The girl's hand tightened around the railing, but she didn't look over. She had learned, early and well, that silence could be armor if you wore it long enough. So instead, she stared into the horse's eyes and whispered a name she hadn't said in years. Button. She wasn't sure where the name came from. Maybe it had been buried, like the memory of a song sung over soap and basin water, back when the world had corners softened by warmth. The crowd jostled. The auctioneer was running out of jokes. Lot 46 had gone to a woman with a pearl-handled whip. Lot 45 hadn't met reserve. Now Lot 47 stood blinking, legs trembling slightly, with no opening bid. No one wanted him. No one but her. And she didn't have a dime. The auctioneer cleared his throat, ready to move on. All right, folks, next. Wait. Her voice wasn't loud, but the stillness made it louder than it needed to be. Heads turned. She felt her face flush, but didn't back down. Could someone, she tried again, softer this time, just buy him? The crowd laughed. Not cruel, exactly. Just indifferent. The way people laugh when they've forgotten how not to. Someone near the front raised an eyebrow. You offering charity, sweetheart? She didn't answer. Her hand dropped to her side, clenched hard. She hadn't meant to speak. The words had slipped out, born of too many nights staring at ceilings and barns that didn't belong to her. She was about to turn away when a quiet motion caught her eye. A single hand, gloved in leather, lifted just enough for the auctioneer to see. 100 credits, the man said, voice low. Silence again. This one heavier. The bidder stood at the back edge of the ring, where the shadow from the hay barn half covered him. Tall, broad in the shoulders, dressed in weathered wool and a dark coat that didn't catch the wind so much as ignore it. His face was plain, but not forgettable. Lined in the right places. Clean-shaven, except for a dusting of gray at the chin. His eyes never left the horse. The auctioneer blinked. Well, that's 100 to the gentleman. Do I hear 150? No one spoke. Not even to laugh now. Sold. The gavel hit wood, and the sound was like a lid slamming on something delicate. The girl watched as the man walked forward without hurry, gave his details to the clerk, and turned toward the horse. Button didn't flinch. He only lowered his head and let the man touch his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, too quietly for him to hear. But he turned anyway, looked at her, and then did something no one else had in a long time. He nodded. They didn't speak again for nearly 10 minutes. Just walked side by side down the slope of the auction yard to where a battered old hauler waited. Paint faded, tires chewed with time, and straw bits stuck to the seats. She followed only because he opened the passenger side and didn't say a word. He drove like someone who'd been alone for a while. Quiet hands, no radio, and a gaze that didn't wander. She kept her arms wrapped around herself and stared out the window at the gray hills that rolled like sleeping beasts in the distance. Button, she murmured, more to herself than to him. He didn't look over. Odd name. She blinked. I guess. It sounded like something he'd answer to. The man hummed, not in disagreement or approval. Just sound, drifting like smoke in the cabin. Miles passed. Then a fork in the road, then gravel. A metal gate swung open with a groan, and the truck eased through. The ranch wasn't big, but it sprawled. Fences curled around patches of brittle grass, and a barn stood crooked at the hip but strong at the roofline. There was a porch that faced west, and a single porch light that flickered even in the afternoon gloom. He parked near the stable, stepped out, and began unloading Button with slow, practiced hands. She stayed in the truck until he turned back and said, "He'll need brushing." She got out then, wordlessly, took the lead rope and walked Button through the stable doors like they'd done it 100 times before. The stall smelled of cedar shavings and old warmth. She ran her fingers over Button's flank and whispered, "See? Not so bad." The man stood in the doorway. His presence filled it. "I don't need a hand," he said finally. "I know," she replied, brushing the horse's neck. "I didn't come to help." He tilted his head. "Then why'd you come?" She didn't answer. She didn't know. After a long pause, he said, "You can sleep in the loft. Hay's clean. Gets cold at night." She nodded once. He left without another word. That night, she lay under a thick quilt someone had left neatly folded on the hay bale near the far wall. Wind scratched at the slats, and owls whispered secrets to the dark. She wrote a letter in her mind. "Dear Mom," it began. But she didn't finish it. Instead, she rolled onto her side and stared at the rafters until Button shifted below her and snorted softly, like a dream trying to breathe. The next morning, the man left coffee on a wooden crate by the stable door. She didn't drink it. Just stood there, watching steam rise into the pale morning, and wondered how a man could be so kind without smiling. The horse nickered once. She fed him an apple she'd saved from her coat pocket. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered, and she wasn't sure if she meant Button or the man. It snowed lightly that afternoon, just enough to make the world quiet. And somewhere between the silence and the softness, something old in her heart stirred, like a song almost remembered. Like something that hadn't belonged for a long time, finally finding its way home. The loft grew colder as the nights lengthened, but she never complained. She'd learned to make peace with discomfort, how to sleep curled like a comma, how to breathe into cupped hands until fingers tingled back to life. She placed her boots by the wall and lined them with hay so they'd be warm in the morning. It wasn't home, but it was quiet. The man kept his distance. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. He left food near the barn door, biscuits wrapped in cloth, coffee in a tin cup, a peeled orange once, split neatly in half. She watched the way he moved, never loud, never rushed. He was like a man who'd once lived beside mirrors and had since learned to live without them. Every motion was intentional. He didn't glance at his reflection in windows or puddles. And his house, though large enough, had no glass where a man might catch sight of himself when he wasn't ready. The ranch held the silence of people who used to fill it. An extra coat still hung on a hook by the porch, its sleeves empty but undisturbed. There were horses, 3 others, one chestnut, one black with a twisted ear, and a mare who didn't trust anybody. None were young. Button had settled in, slow and uncertain, but willing. She brushed him daily, clearing the burrs from his coat, speaking in half-sentences like she used to as a child with stray dogs that visited the alley behind the bakery. She spoke to him not to be heard, but to be understood. "You've been laughed at too," she told him one morning. "They always laugh when they don't know what else to do." Button's ears flicked toward her, then back to the barn door. That was the day she rode him. Not far, just a circle around the inner corral, with no saddle and nothing in her hands but trust. He swayed beneath her like a boat long out of water. She didn't kick or coax, only breathed. He moved forward, uneven and proud. The man watched from the porch. He didn't speak, just leaned one arm on the railing and let her finish. That night, she left a note beside the coffee tin. "He remembers." In the morning, the tin was gone. But beside the barn door, in its place, sat an old leather saddle, oiled and ready. She touched it like a sacred thing. They didn't become friends, not exactly. But a rhythm emerged, like a song no one remembered writing. He mended fences. She swept the stalls. He split wood and stacked it in perfect, deliberate piles. She brought in water and left it warming beside the stove. They never ate together. But she always found a plate set near the porch when dusk fell. One fork, one napkin, always warm. The loft became more hers each day. She hung her coat on a bent nail. She swept, once, without being asked. She folded the blanket after every night. And when the wind howled and scattered leaves across the yard, she learned to sit on the steps of the barn, drink the coffee he left, and wrap her fingers around the cup like it held more than warmth. She still didn't know his name, but she began to call the place a where instead of a somewhere. One morning, the sky woke late, wrapped in mist. The fields outside the ranch looked soft-edged, like someone had erased the borders between here and there. She walked with Button through the pasture, letting the reins drag and watching his breath bloom like fog. Halfway to the fence line, she heard the truck. A boy stepped out. 17, maybe. Light hair, hands too big for his jacket. He had a delivery, grain, wrapped in burlap and labeled in a neat scrawl. "You live here?" he asked. She shrugged. "Sort of." "That your horse?" She looked at Button, who had stopped to rub his face against her shoulder. "I think I'm his." The boy smiled like he didn't quite understand, but wanted to. They didn't talk long. Just enough to say names and weather and maybe against. She watched the truck drive off, a little bit of gravel following behind. Later that evening, she found a new halter by the barn door. Soft leather. Blue. The man said nothing. But he looked at Button longer than usual, and when he turned away, his shoulders were stiffer than the wind could explain. That night, she didn't sleep well. Dreams tugged at her, memories of rooms with locked cabinets and foster homes with schedules taped to the fridge. Dreams of her mother's voice humming over dishwater, a lullaby with no words. When she woke, her cheeks were damp. She climbed down from the loft and stood outside in the cold, barefoot in the straw, staring at the horizon like it owed her something. The man stood by the fence. He held a lantern but didn't light it. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She hesitated. "Just didn't want to dream anymore." He nodded once. "That happens." She walked to him slowly. They stood in silence, watching clouds move across the moon. The barn creaked behind them like a ship in harbor. "Why'd you buy him?" she asked, not looking at him. The man answered after a while. He looked like someone who needed to be chosen. She swallowed. "And me." He didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he lit the lantern, handed it to her, and turned back toward the porch. The next few days unfolded like pages that had already been written. She began to hum when she worked, small songs with no tune, just sound. The man noticed but said nothing. She found an old paperback left in the hayloft. Fairy tales, bound in cracked leather. She read them to Button, her voice soft and clear in the dim light. "They always think the quiet ones are the weak ones," she said one afternoon, brushing his mane. "But those are the ones who survive." Button chewed his oats, indifferent. She placed a ribbon around his neck, a bit of twine she'd dyed with berries. It wasn't much, but it made him look like something more than forgotten. Rain came. It lasted 2 days, steady and silver. On the second night, thunder rolled over the fields, and the sky peeled open like old bark. Button panicked. He kicked the stall door until the wood splintered. She ran barefoot through the rain, hair soaked and coat forgotten. He thrashed, eyes wide and blind with memory. She didn't shout. She climbed into the stall, placed both hands on his chest, and sang. Quietly. A song her mother used to hum. It had no words. Just warmth. Button stilled. His breath slowed. When the man arrived, soaked and ready with a lasso, he found her kneeling beside the horse, hand on his flank, eyes closed. She didn't look up. He didn't speak, only knelt beside her and placed one hand over hers. They stayed like that until the storm passed. The next morning, she found a note beneath her coffee cup. It was her own, one she'd tucked into the saddle blanket days ago. It had been opened, but not torn. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and placed it beneath her pillow. That night, she wrote another letter. No name at the top. No signature at the bottom. Just this: if I never leave, will it be enough? She didn't know who it was meant for. But when she left it on the kitchen table the next morning, she saw the porch light was fixed. It glowed soft gold against the gray. And the front door, usually shut, was left a crack open. Not wide. Just enough. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in uncertain moments. A thawed patch near the fence line, a thread of birdsong in the trees, a wind that smelled faintly of something alive. The kind of arrival that made you pause mid-step and wonder if you were imagining it. She had begun to plant things. Nothing ambitious. Just a row of marigolds along the porch, seeds pressed gently into the warming soil. The man didn't say anything when he saw them. Just left a bent trowel beside the steps one morning, rusted from disuse but sharpened recently. That was how they spoke now. Through objects. Through gestures. She sanded the porch railing until it stopped snagging sleeves. He fixed the latch on the stable door so it closed without shouting. The farm, once crusted in stillness, began to stretch out of its long hibernation. Button's coat had begun to shine again. The sway in his step remained, but it no longer felt like defeat. It felt like rhythm. He followed her without need of a lead, and sometimes she spoke to him in full sentences. "You're not just here," she said one morning, brushing the dust from his flank. "You belong." He blew softly through his nose, and she took it as agreement. The man had taken to watching her ride. Never close. From a distance, porch, fence, the shadow of the barn. He never called out. But she felt it. That quiet attention. Like a tether that didn't pull but simply reminded her it was there. She began to wave to him now and then. Just a small flick of her fingers over the saddle horn. He'd nod once. Then disappear into whatever task he used to keep from talking too much. One evening, she found a tin box on the kitchen table. Inside were old photographs, black and white, edges curled like dried leaves. A girl, about her age, sitting bareback on a paint pony. A man standing behind her, a hand resting gently on the withers. His smile was wide then. Softer. She closed the box carefully and placed it where she'd found it. The next morning, he made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. They drank it on the porch without speaking. A few days later, the boy from town returned. He had a truck bed full of hay and a smile that had grown braver since winter. "You been riding?" he asked. She nodded. "Most days. I'm helping my uncle train a new filly. Maybe you could come see her sometime." The man stepped out of the barn just then, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't say anything, but his eyes landed on the boy, then flicked to her, then back again. She felt the shift in the air. "I'll think about it," she said. That night, she found a bucket of fresh apples by Button's stall. He didn't like apples. She fed them to the mare with the twisted ear instead. A storm came through one night. Nothing violent, just rain that made the walls groan and the roof speak in drips. She woke to find a leak above her cot, a slow, persistent tap that kept time with her thoughts. She didn't go back to sleep. Instead, she climbed down the ladder and opened the barn door to the pasture. The sky was milk-white with mist, and the world looked blurred at the edges, as though someone had taken a wet cloth to the outline of everything. Button wandered beside her, his steps slow and heavy with sleep. She found herself at the oak tree at the far edge of the fence. She hadn't noticed it much before, but now it felt like a place you'd come to whisper to the past. She sat beneath it and took the folded letter from her coat pocket, the one she hadn't meant to leave behind. It wasn't addressed. It didn't need to be. She read it silently. "You don't owe me anything. But you gave me silence I could rest in. That was more than most. The man found her there, eventually. His boots announced him before his voice did. You buried something? He asked. She shook her head. Not yet. He sat beside her without asking. They always come here, he said. The ones I couldn't help. She glanced at him. You tried. He nodded. Sometimes I was too late. Sometimes they didn't want what I had. And me. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old ribbon, blue, faded, frayed at one end. She wore it in her hair, he said. Every Sunday, even when it rained. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Just long. Did she go? She asked finally. He nodded. Sickness. Quick. Quiet. I don't think she was ever scared. She made me promise to keep things the way they were. You didn't. No, I didn't. She looked out across the pasture. The rain had stopped, but the earth still wore its sorrow. You don't owe me anything, she said again, louder this time. He looked at her then. Really looked. But I want to. The next day, she taught him how to curry a horse without making it flinch. He held the brush awkwardly, his hands too stiff, his motions too fast. Gentle, she said. Like you're brushing out a memory. He tried again. Slower this time. Button didn't move away. She watched the man's shoulders loosen, just a fraction. You could have left, he said quietly. I almost did. Why didn't you? She didn't answer. Instead, she led Button into the pasture and ran beside him until the sun turned their shadows gold. Later that week, the boy returned with a flyer, handwritten, corners thumbed. A spring fair in town. Events. Ribbons. Showings. You should enter, he said. She blinked. With Button. Why not? She laughed softly. They laughed at him once. At both of us. Let them, he shrugged. Win anyway. She didn't say yes. But she didn't say no, either. The man said nothing when she showed him the flyer. Just looked at it, then folded it carefully and slid it beneath the sugar jar. But the next morning, she found a brush set by the stall. Clean. New. And beside it, a comb she recognized from the photograph. She began to prepare slowly. Brushing Button every morning. Braiding his mane in a simple pattern her mother once taught her using twine and steady hands. She stitched a patch onto his old blanket. A star. A small one. You'll be seen now, she whispered. But on our terms. The man watched. From the porch. From the fence. From behind the glassless window of the barn. He didn't speak until the morning they loaded Button into the trailer. You sure? He asked. She looked up from the latch. No. Good, he said. Only fools are sure. She smiled. Then you've got company. He chuckled once, the sound dry and unfamiliar on his tongue. They drove in silence. But it was a warmer one than before. She sat beside him, back straight, hands folded in her lap. He tapped the wheel once, like he wanted to say something. When he did, it was simple. She would have liked you. I would have liked her. He nodded. That was enough. The fairground shimmered with color, ribbons fluttering, children laughing, the smell of kettle corn and horse sweat filling the air. She hadn't been in a crowd in a long time. It made her small again. But then Button nickered beside her, and she remembered who she was now. People stared. Some pointed. Some whispered. She heard fragments. Is that the one from the auction? Didn't think he'd last the winter. She lifted her chin and led Button into the ring. They didn't win. But he trotted proudly, mane braided, steps sure. And she wore no shoes, just the feel of the earth beneath her feet and the sound of something like redemption in the air. When she turned to look at the stands, she saw the man. He wore a hat that didn't fit and boots too clean to be comfortable. But he was clapping. Quietly. Steadily. She bowed. Not to the judges. To him. They drove home under a soft twilight. When they reached the ranch, she didn't go to the loft. She went to the porch and sat beside him. The silence didn't need filling. But she broke it anyway. Will you tell me her name? He looked at her, eyes tired and full. Clara. She repeated it softly. Clara. Then reached into her pocket and pulled out the ribbon he'd given her. She was loved, she said. He nodded. Still is. The stars blinked into being overhead. Somewhere in the pasture, Button nickered once, as if calling the day to sleep. She stood to go, then turned back. I'm staying, she said. He didn't smile. But something in his face unfolded. Good, he said. And for the first time, the porch light stayed on all night. The day Button galloped, really galloped, was the day she called the man by his first name. It was morning, pale and golden, the kind of light that made everything feel gentler, even the air. She'd let Button into the wide pasture after brushing him down, and he'd stood there for a long time just breathing it in. Then something changed. A small flicker of wind, maybe, or a bird flitting just too close. Whatever it was, it made him move, not with the stiff sway of age, but with the sudden, startling grace of memory. He ran. Not fast, not far, but with a kind of stubborn joy. And she laughed. A sharp, delighted sound that carried all the way to the porch where the man stood with his hands in his pockets, watching. She turned toward him, cheeks flushed. You see that, Thomas? It was the first time she'd said it. Not, sir, not nothing at all. Just his name, plain and unburdened. He didn't reply. Just nodded once, eyes on the old horse kicking up bits of spring grass like a colt again. Later, over breakfast, he slid a plate across the table to her without looking up. Toast, eggs, a single bright orange flower tucked beside the fork. She didn't mention it. Just ate with quiet gratitude. Their mornings had begun to follow this unspoken rhythm. Him at the stove, her near the window, Button whickering just outside like he belonged there, too. There were no clocks in the kitchen, only the shadows moving across the floorboards and the smell of bread when it was nearly done. She planted more things. Not just flowers this time, beans, squash, a stubborn row of carrots along the back fence. The soil was stubborn, but she coaxed it loose, inch by inch, with her hands and patience. You grow what you tend, Thomas said one day, handing her a worn watering can. Even the broken things? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Especially those. The boy from town came by sometimes. Brought fresh feed, or just excuses to talk. He never stayed long. But he always smiled at her like she mattered, and she always offered him lemonade in chipped glasses that once belonged to someone else. Thomas watched these meetings from a careful distance. One afternoon, after the boy had gone, Thomas found her in the barn, polishing the old saddle. You like him? He asked. She didn't look up. He's kind. That's not an answer. She ran her fingers over the leather. I don't know if I'm ready to be liked. Not in the way he means. He nodded. Fair. She waited a moment before adding, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. That made him smile, faint and fleeting. Even better. Later that week, she found an envelope tucked into the barn ledger. Cream-colored, official-looking, but small. Her name was printed neatly on the front, her real name, not the one she'd gone by before. Inside was a letter from the agency. Her foster status was ending. Legally, she was almost someone else's problem. Or no one's at all. She read it twice. Then folded it and walked out to the pasture where Button waited near the oak. Thomas was mending a gate nearby, and she stood silently until he looked up. I don't have to leave, she said. No. But I could. He set his hammer down. You could. What if I don't? He wiped his hands on a cloth. Then we find out what happens next. She nodded once, then stepped toward him and reached into her coat. This came, she said, holding out the letter. He didn't take it. Just looked at her, eyes steady. You don't have to show me that. I know. But I want to. He read it slowly, then handed it back. I've got extra rooms, he said. I don't need a room. I know. I need a place. He looked down at the ground for a long time, then back at her. I'll build you one. She laughed. What, a house? No, he said. A place. Days passed like petals drifting down from an unseen hand. She hung linens on the line and watched them sway like white flags. She taught Button to respond to soft whistles. She fixed the swing on the porch and used it often, reading old books aloud as the breeze rocked her gently. Thomas cleared out the spare room. Not because she asked, but because she'd started humming in the hallway. She stopped writing letters. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had someone to say it to now. One evening, while making supper, she asked him to tell her a story. He hesitated, then said, "Once, there was a man who thought silence could save him." Did it? No, he said. But it kept him safe long enough to be saved. She reached across the table and poured him tea. And the girl. She thought no one remembered her. Did they? She remembered herself. She smiled. That's a good story. I'm still writing the ending. Me too. Spring deepened. The grass turned soft and bright beneath their feet, and the farm began to feel not just lived in, but lived with. The land breathed differently. It no longer seemed suspended in sorrow. It had learned to bend around the ache. One morning, she found a new halter on Button's post. A soft blue one, embroidered with a single word, home. She didn't cry. She just placed her forehead against the old horse's mane and whispered thank you. That afternoon, she took Thomas's old boots from the shed, oiled them, and placed them beside the front door. He noticed but said nothing. The next day, he wore them. She started leaving the porch light on. Just a small thing. But it made the farmhouse glow at night like a held breath. Thomas noticed, of course. You expecting someone? She shook her head. Just not ready to turn it off yet. One night, he came outside and found her on the swing, knees tucked beneath her chin, staring at the stars. He sat beside her, and for a while, neither spoke. Then she said, "My mother used to tell me forgiveness was like watering something you didn't plant." He looked at her, and I think she meant it still matters, even if you don't see it bloom. He nodded. You think Button forgives them? The ones who laughed. I don't think Button remembers the laughter, Thomas said. Only the hand that stayed. She looked at him. What do you remember? He didn't answer. Not in words. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently. The way someone might touch their own reflection if it looked back with kindness. The day Button passed, it was early summer. Warm breeze. Quiet birds. No pain, just stillness. She found him lying in the field beneath the oak, eyes closed as if napping. She didn't cry at first. Just sat beside him and traced the ribbon still tied to his mane, the one she'd left months ago. Thomas came later, said nothing, and helped her bury him beneath the tree. They planted marigolds over the grave. Afterward, she sat beside the mound, hands stained with earth, and whispered. He remembered. Thomas placed something beside her. An envelope. Inside was a letter. It read, I bought the horse for you. I just didn't know it then. She held it to her chest and finally let herself cry. That night, the swing creaked under both their weight. He looked up at the stars, then down at her. You staying? He asked. She smiled through her tears. I was never really gone. He nodded, satisfied. The porch light flickered, then steadied, and somewhere, in the quiet of the land that had forgotten itself and begun to remember, came the sound of laughter. Soft, free, and whole.